Gabriel Sanders. I direct public programs here at the museum, and it's my great pleasure on this glorious January afternoon to welcome you to today's discussion of Alon Confino's A World Without Jews, the Nazi Imagination from Persecution to Genocide. It should come as no surprise to those here that Holocaust studies is a growth industry. In the introduction to his book, Professor Confino writes that the Third Reich is the most written about topic in history. He isolates a period of just 5 years from 1995 to 2000, during which some 12,000 titles were published on the subject. A field this vast requires its synthesizers, and what Confino has offered here is a work of synthesis. It's a book that reckons with what's out there, but also steps away from it to take a broader look. When focused too tightly on just what happened, Confino argues, one can sometimes lose sight of the why. So we hope to get some illumination on the question of why from Professor Confino this afternoon. Alon Confino is professor of history at the University of Virginia and at Israel's Ben Gurion University. He's the author of 3 previous books in German and Holocaust history. Confino will be joined on stage by Liel Leibovitz, a senior writer at Tablet magazine. Interestingly, both Confino and Leibovitz are Israeli-born thinkers who went to college in Israel and to graduate school in the US, and both have made their professional homes in America. I wonder if this will come up somehow. Leibovitz is the author of a number of books, including a comparative study of the idea of chosenness in Israel and America, and most recently, a meditation on singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen. Before welcoming them to the stage, I'd like to ask you to silence your cell phones. It's my pleasure to say that the museum's public programs are made possible through a generous gift from Mrs. Lily Safra. At 4:30 today, in this very room, the museum will be sponsoring a discussion of Ebola and ethics with Brooke Gladstone of NPR and a number of others. So if the rain should continue to fall, bear in mind that there will be exciting programming here for you until late into the evening. With that, I give you Liel Leibovitz and Alon Confino.
Up left, that's traditionally the hot seat. Hello, everyone. I don't use this word lightly, but in light of the weather, you people are heroes for being here, and we hope to make the next hour worth your while. I also apologize. I will be reading my questions from the tragically inelegant device in my pocket, which makes life just too easy to resist. Notes would have been more decorous, but such is the time. It is my honor to be here tonight with Professor Confino because the book that we will discuss today is a truly astonishing work. As Gabe mentioned in his remarks, there are a lot of Holocaust-related works, and if one, like myself, is of the disposition to be, immersed in this world, one feels very often like the gentleman who's walking in a maze and having the feeling that you've been through the same turn about 100 times before. This is a very different book. It is first and foremost a book of ideas, which sadly is something that is increasingly rare in our cultural landscape. And the core idea that it argues is one that made me, and I'm sure will make you, stop in my tracks and reevaluate everything that I thought I had known. And so I would like to begin by reading a very brief paragraph that I think captures this idea, and then asking Professor Confino to elaborate on it. The Nazis, you're right, did imagine a clear narrative arc of the relations between German and Jews from the dawn of history to the present. Right from the beginning, they were certain about one thing, which did not change until the last day of the Reich. The Jews and their historical roots, real or invented, from the Bible down to the modern period, must be eliminated at all costs and whatever the consequences. The Nazis did not leave standing one cultural edifice that implied a cultural debt to the Jews. This amounted to making a new civilization by uprooting a key element of their own roots. In other words, the persecution, the annihilation, was not the outcome of a racial, or not solely the outcome of a racial ideology. It was not, as some, who sometimes are referred to as functionalists argue, just a result of a war and death machine gone haywire. It was an attempt to completely destroy all memory of Jews from history itself. First of all, is that an accurate description? And second of all, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more.
Yes, thank you, Liel. So I'd like to thank you all for coming this rainy day. I'd like to thank Gabe Sanders and the museum for inviting me, and to Liel for being my partner in conversation. So I'm interested in the stories we tell ourselves in order to give meaning to our lives. When I say we, I mean we as individuals and as collectivities. We all tell ourselves stories as we go along. And we tell ourselves these stories not in order to get the facts right. These sometimes happen. But we tell ourselves stories in order to get the facts wrong, in order to give meaning to our life. So when we think about our life as individuals, we think about an event that happened to us, say when we were 18, a very important event in our life. We tell ourselves this event in a certain way when we are 20, when we are 30, when we are 40, and so on. And every time, the meaning of this event is, of course, a little bit different, because our life is different, our context is different, our understanding of who we are is different. So I wanted to know what was the story that the Nazis told themselves, about themselves, in this way, justifying the persecution and extermination of the Jews. Because especially when we do bad things, or when we do things that we know are transgressive, even if we think that they are justified, we have to have a very good story to go along with it, precisely because we know that these events are problematic. And the Nazis knew that their genocide of the Jews is transgressive. They were aware that it is different than other genocides that they committed. So what was the story that they told themselves in order to justify it? Because even if we do bad things, rarely we tell ourselves, I do bad things and I'm a bad person. No, we say I'm doing a bad thing, but I'm a good person. There is a reason why I do it. I'm justified to do it. So this was the core idea of the book. And we tell these stories from the point of view of the present. So I looked at Germans, people in the 30s and the 40s, and what story they told themselves. And the story they told themselves is that there is an evil force at work in history, from the beginning until the present. And this force is the Jews. And in order to create a new civilization, a new racial civilization, a new humanity, you have to excise this force from history. Had the Nazis been interested only in moving from Weimar democracy to Third Reich dictatorship, so it would have been enough just to eliminate the Jews from the universities, from the legal profession, etc. But since they wanted to build a new civilization, a new morality, there was a need to have this apocalyptic evil force and to act against it.
And we see evidence for it. I mean, your book is rich with a whole variety of small and wonderfully told examples. But the one that I think you spend the most time on, and that was, to me, the most jarring, was the fact that in Kristallnacht, in November 9th, 1938, the Nazis didn't just, smash Jewish shops or harass Jewish citizens, but took an inordinate amount of time for people who were supposedly acting on a scientific racialist theory to burn down synagogue and Torah scrolls.
Right. So I start the book with these scenes from Kristallnacht, from November 9th, 1938, in which the Nazis torched 1,400 synagogues in the Reich, in Germany and Austria, which was now part of the Reich. And what I found in the documents, and I will talk about these documents in a second, is that they took the Torah scrolls from the synagogue. They took them out. They took them out in the open to public squares, and they burned them. There is this physicality of the destruction of the Torah scrolls. They rolled them along streets, and they had youngsters ride their bike over them. They tore them to pieces and kept some of the pieces in their pocket, claiming it brings good luck. They had, in some cases, had the Jews torn the Torah scrolls and then burn it themselves. In Vienna, they had the Jews run in the downtown streets with the Torah scrolls tied to their backs. So there is this really the sensual and physical engagement with this book of books in this destroying it. And when I read these sources, I was amazed. I was amazed because such a radical event took place in Christian Jewish civilization. This event is radical, and it needs to be interpreted. But I was also amazed because it was not made part of the usual stories about the Holocaust or the Third Reich or Nazism. So I asked myself, why was it not made part of this story, and how actually do we explain it? The silence of historians here also demanded some explanation. And I was perplexed because I didn't know myself how to interpret it. Now, I would have liked to tell you that I found these sources after a very dangerous research mission, and they were in some kind of, secluded castle in the heart of Europe, in a dusty archive. It would have been a nice story, but it's not. They are published. So there were testimonies taken by Jews, of Jews, shortly after Kristallnacht, and they have been deposited since in the Wiener Library in London. So my perplexity grew. One of the main interpretations of the Holocaust in the last generation has been that the racial ideas of the Nazis are the key for explaining their motivations for the Holocaust. Now, there is no doubt that this racial interpretation of the Third Reich that has emerged in the last generation or so by distinguished scholars such as Saul Friedlander and others, there is no doubt that it is correct. The Nazis did want to build a racial civilization. But there was something too hegemonic in this explanation, that racial ideas that were not that dominant in German society until 1933, suddenly, once the Nazis took power, became so prominent and explained everything in the motivation and beliefs and mentalities of people. This I questioned. And when I thought about these sources of the burning of the synagogue and of the Torah scrolls, I thought, well, if the Nazis wanted to create a racial civilization, then why did they burn the Torah scrolls and the synagogues, which are religious and holy symbols? What's the connection? This is not clear.
And so the connection, of course, would be that the theory was a different, bigger theory. But then I have a question. And this is something that was sort of pecking in the back of my mind as I was, as I was reading your book. The book has this force to it, which I think is common to all, good and worthy works of art, is that at some point it just seems almost obvious. Well, of course this is true, but then you stop and do a double take and ask, well, then why hasn't anyone written it before? By which I don't mean to say, why hasn't anyone come with the idea? But as you said, all this evidence that you call was out there in the open. Why then have we been so devoted to these 2 or 3 other explanations that we note, the racialist explanation or the explanation that it just happened because it happened?
So thanks for the question, because then it allows me also to say the obvious thing, that we all write things standing on the shoulders of others. No one invents the wheel. And we all come to our ideas by reading a lot, by reading insightful books, books that influence us, and then we take different ideas and we mash them a little bit differently. It's a little bit like in the kitchen. Everybody can make a fruit cake, but different good cooks will make a little bit different cakes, you know? This is about interpretations. It's how you connect different things that are in the open, but so let me just give some credit to those scholars who really influenced me. Saul Friedlander and his books about the Holocaust, even if I disagree with some of his interpretations, but also his writing skills and his sensibility to try to look further into the motivations of the killers. There is a very famous historian of early modern Europe named Carlo Ginzburg, who wrote about various other subjects, but he's a great historian. He wrote a lot about how we use evidence and how we try to arrive to the mentalities of people, not by what the sources tell us explicitly, but by combining different things and by questioning the sources. He influenced me. Recent studies about cultural history of the Holocaust by historians such as Claudia Kunz and Peter Fritzsche and others. So in short, I want to say that I'm building here on a body of work.
And yet you departed.
And yet, you are right. And yes, so I think maybe we should start by thinking that at the beginning of telling about the Holocaust as a historical subject was very difficult. The historiography of the Holocaust actually exists from the 1970s. It took some 20 years for scholars to actually start doing the most basic things in history, which is to tell how the story actually happened. Before we even interpret, we need to know how things happened. There are some facts. We remember today that Primo Levi's masterpiece, Survival in Auschwitz, was rejected by 5 distinguished Italian publishing houses in 1947-48, including Einaudi, before it was published by a small publishing house in northern Italy, because the Holocaust was not considered important, because it was not clear yet the meaning of the Holocaust to European history. Until 1970, in 1970, most history books of Europe, modern Europe, did not have anything about the Holocaust. And if they did, it was a few lines or a small paragraph. So it's only from the 1970s, actually, that we have at the beginning of a full-bodied historiography. So it was very difficult to tell it, to integrate it into history. Once this was done in the 70s and 80s, the first task of a lot of historians was simply to tell what the story was. And then, from the mid-80s, we have various interpretations that are very powerful. The racial interpretations. The Nazis wanted to build a racial civilization, and the racial idea is the key element in their motivations and beliefs. Another very strong interpretation is to look at the administrative state process that made the Holocaust possible. So the trains that deported the Jews, the functioning of the death camps, of the concentration camps, of the labor camps. Another important interpretation was to look at the brutalization of the Second World War, and especially in the Eastern Front. So this brutalization, especially in the war between Russia and Germany, made German soldiers into killers. These 3 interpretations that I just mentioned often went together. So the racial one, the brutalization of the war, and the administrative process of the extermination.
And these, not to interrupt, but these are, I'm going to use a very strange word, these are almost comforting explanations, right? Because at some point they're logical, reasonable, accounts. Whereas the one that you advocate is, and I think you say it at some point later in the epilogue, it's almost like mythology come to life. It's something so strange that it's almost unfathomable to imagine it happen.
So these interpretations looked for relations of cause and effect. What happened in the 30s then led to something that happened in the 40s. I tried to look at relations of meaning, not at causes and cause and effect. I said, let's do what we call cultural history of the Holocaust. Let's look at the imagination that made this persecution and extermination possible to begin with. It's a very different kind of question than the question that drove the previous interpretations. I looked for relations of meanings. I looked for, I will give you an example. A very important question in the historiography in the last generation was, so were Germans really Nazis? And I asked, what really is really? I mean, Nazi ideology changed over time. And how can we measure whether people were 20% Nazis or 40 or 60? There is no point. What is more important is to think at what kind of imagination society enables, whether you agree to it or disagree with it. Not everybody has to agree with the persecution and extermination of the Jews, but you have to imagine it to make it possible. Even if you disagree, you already imagined it. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit like slavery. Let's think about slavery 1850 in America. There are some slaveholders and there are some abolitionists. But also the abolitionists can imagine slavery. Otherwise, they will have nothing to be against. They can imagine it. Because they imagine it, they can be against it. Mm-hmm. I would argue that these days, for us to think that we will have a slave at home is something that we cannot imagine as a society. We can imagine genocides. We can imagine other forms of atrocities. But to have a slave, a human being that is your property, is something that we can't imagine anymore. But it was imaginable 150 years ago. So it's this kind of a question that breaks from the usual historiography.
And that makes the question that has been, I would say, even about a decade and a half ago at the forefront, what did the Germans know about what was actually happening and when did they know it, almost kind of beside the point, right? Because the point is not knowing, the point is being able to conceive of the possibility.
Exactly. What the Germans know, I show in my book, is actually, surprisingly, not such an interesting question. Because towards the end of the book, I talk about the deportation of the Jews from German cities. This is late 1941, 1942. So the Jews are being rounded up, and they are usually being paraded in town to a certain place, to the train station, or to where buses and trucks will take them, and they are taken to the east for resettlement. Now we are already in 1941. After 1938, there is no Judaism in Germany. Kristallnacht was not strictly speaking about the Jews. It was not against Jews, it was against Judaism. From November 10th, 1938, Judaism, that has been part of German society for centuries, ceased to exist. Even while there were a few more Jews living in Germany, for the time being. So by 1941, we don't have Judaism anymore. Jews are not part of the public space, but this is already for years. From the mid-30s, Jews cannot go to swimming pools, they cannot go to museums, they cannot participate in a cultural evening like you are now participating. Scholars in the universities cannot cite in their dissertations or in their works scholars by Jews. Jews are gone. So in 1941, the mass killings of the Jews are already in full swing, and people know, they know about it, because the soldiers write from the front, because there are rumors, because there are pictures. When these Jews but they are made to walk in town, late 1941, with one suitcase. They usually parade, they walk in town with silence. Everybody is silent. The Germans that look at them and the Jews. There is an act of a finale. There is an act of there is a sense of a final act of Jewish existence in Germany. Now, people did not know about Auschwitz. They did not know about the gas chambers. But I ask, what did they imagine that these people, how are they going to start a new life with one suitcase in tow in the East? After years of persecution, of violence, of the elimination of Judaism. So the question whether they really know about the gas chambers in Auschwitz, the answer is probably most people didn't know. But what could they imagine is going to happen to these people?
So let me step back from the argument, although I promise to get back to it very soon and get personal a little bit. Was there a Eureka moment for you? You know, a moment of sitting at your desk, leafing through a book, and then looking up and saying, I think I have it. I think it's a brand new idea.
There was.
Oh, please.
But it started differently. So maybe I should say something about myself. May I?
Always. That's why we're here.
So I grew up in Jerusalem in the 1960s and 70s. And then I went to, I did my military service. I traveled a little bit around the world. Then I came back and I did my BA in Tel Aviv University in history. I decided that I wanted to do history, and I thought, well, I want to do an important history. Since I was a provincial guy from Jerusalem, I thought that European history is important. Because in the 60s and the 70s, Israel was still a provincial place. There was one TV channel. European culture was very dominant. You know, there wasn't the internet. America was far away, and other parts of the world didn't even exist. So I was a provincial guy, of course, quote unquote, and I chose Europe. And I thought, okay, so which history is important in Europe? I thought Germany. Now, why did I choose Germany? It's a good question, of course. But I grew up in Israel, and Germany was important. Then I went to Berkeley to do my PhD, and suddenly I discovered amazing things. There were people who were working on nuns in the Middle Ages. Not only this, lesbian nuns. I thought, wow, these are cool topics. Where was I when I decided to do German history or European history? It is in this sense that I say sometimes we choose our direction, not because we know what we are doing, but because we don't know. Because of the wrong reasons. There is a lot of contingency in how we choose what to do. Okay, so I did German history, but from the beginning, I told myself I'm not going to work about the Third Reich and the Holocaust. And this, it was clear to me. I thought that the topic is, although there's no one in my family that is directly connected to the Holocaust, I thought the topic demands a certain wisdom and a certain understanding of human motivation that comes with experience and with profundity. Not that I was 30 years old, not that I didn't have my own share of it, but I felt, leave it aside. If in the future I'll have something important to say about it, I will say. But if not, I'll do something else. And indeed, for many years, I worked on other things in German history, and I especially worked on in a kind of an approach that is new in the last generation or so, that is called memory studies. So it comes back to my story about how people tell themselves stories. I'm very interested in how societies tell themselves stories about themselves and how they remember their past. So if you think, for example, about Americans, how Americans tell themselves the story of slavery and the Civil War. from 1865 to the present, it changes. Changes according to the context, according to what we think about ourselves, about African Americans, etc., etc. So it's this how societies create a certain remembrance, a certain story, and we create it through national holidays, through school textbooks, through all sorts of social mechanisms. I worked on that, and in the scholarship about historical remembrance, of course, the memory of the Holocaust was very important. How we remember the Holocaust since 1945. So I looked at that. So I arrived to the Holocaust, even if I didn't work on it, if I said, and then I saw that we have a lot of books about how we have remembered the Holocaust since 1945, and about German remembrance before 1933, but we don't have scholarship or books about what seemed to me a very, very important subject, how Germans remembered their own history during the Third Reich, and how they made sense of it, and how they justified the persecution and extermination of the Jews. So now we make a full circle. And I said, I want to write this book, I want to write this story. And I first wrote a book published a few years ago, Foundational Past, The Holocaust as Historical Understanding, which is a short theoretical book, more for scholars, in which I made the case for a cultural history of the Holocaust, and I criticized the racial interpretation. And as I wrote this book, I said, you know, you never liked when people told you what to do as historians and they didn't do it themselves. If you are such a wise guy and you know what needs to be done in Holocaust studies, do it. Write this book that brings the cultural history of the Holocaust. Well, of course, I told it to myself because I already had this idea. And there was a certain idea in which I understood that the idea of how Germans remember the past and the idea of time linked. Because what I say in the book, and perhaps we'll discuss it in the books, that the Jews actually represented for the Nazis historical time. It's the issue of time that made the persecution of the Jews unique.
And so they need to be eliminated, because as long as the old morality exists, the new Nazi understanding of what a morality might be cannot thrive.
Right. Because as an evil historical force, the Jews represented for the Nazis a certain historical time that needed to be eliminated. So the Jews, first of all, represented an un-German, objectionable modernity. The adjective Jewish, or Jewish, represented for the Nazis Bolshevism and communism and capitalism and liberalism and psychoanalysis and jazz music and expressionism and Bauhaus architecture and all the things in the modern world that the Nazis detested. Now, so the Jews represented the Nazi revolution because only the Jews could represent one and the same thing, opposite things. They could represent capitalism and Bolshevism, communism and liberalism. It's the Jews that gave a certain symbolic, the Jews became a kind of a symbol for an objectionable modernity. That does not mean that the Nazis were anti-modern. They were very modern. They were part and parcel of modernity. But they wanted to create a different modernity. An anti-communist, anti-liberal, and against Jewish influences. So this was one time. In a time of modernity.
And so you write, Nazis and Jews shared a belief in the power of the book and in the necessity of stories to give meaning to life. That is why the Nazis wanted to destroy the Jewish Bible, history, and memory, and why Jews clung to them. Stories give life, and stories kill as well. Did we then see a contest of stories? I mean, it's obvious, I think, to anyone sitting here, the profound importance of storytelling for Jewish life. We're on the cusp in a sort of way of Passover, in which the entire thing is the element of storytelling. Was it our story versus theirs? And if so, what was it about ours that triumphed?
Yeah, it was a contest of stories and a contest of memories. We have to recognize that the Nazis exterminated the Jews not only because they thought that they are Untermensch, that they are vermin, that they are racially inferior, but also because they believed that there is an enormous power in the Jews. Because if you don't believe that someone is so powerful, why would you go to such length to kill him? It's the power, it's the Nazi belief in the power of the Jews that made them, deport Jewish children from Rome to Auschwitz. Otherwise, why bother? So the Jews were at one and the same time for the Nazis Untermensch and endowed with this enormous symbolic power, the symbolic power of morality, of the Bible, of the Ten Commandments, of the storytelling that goes along with it. And this is why the Nazis wanted to kill all the Jews, but they didn't want to erase the remembrance from the world. They wanted to be those who will tell the history of the Jews after the victorious war and after all the Jews would be exterminated. And this is why part of the book discusses the Nazis' effort to collect Judaica and to collect Jewish artifacts and Jewish books, because they planned a museum for the period after the war in which they will tell the history of the Jews and they will explain why this evil force was evil and how the Nazis overcame them. So again, here we have this, my book plays a lot with dualities. So the Nazis thought of the Jews as Untermensch, but also as very powerful. The Nazis wanted to exterminate the Jews, but also to tell their story. And this was the power of storytelling.
But they had, and this is a point that you make that I think is absolutely brilliant. You write, the Nazi Memory Project was built in a contradiction. By assigning the Jews historical importance that merited total extermination, which is what you just said, they also ensured that the crime would not and could not be forgotten, be it in a world with or without Jews.
The Jews were too important. The Nazis made them so important. So, because their project was not only to have a Germany without Jews, but a Europe without Jews. Because now the way maybe in parentheses we will say, now the way that historians look at the Nazi conquest in Europe between 1939 to 1945 is the making of a Nazi empire. Just like we have the British Empire, the French Empire, we speak the Ottoman Empire, we speak also about the Nazi Empire. The difference is that this was an empire in Europe, subjugating Europeans, not like the French, Dutch, or British Empire that subjugated other people around the world, in Asia, in Africa, etc., in the Middle East. The Nazis built also a colonial empire, only its subjects were the Europeans. So,
I want to ask two quick questions, and then I would love to turn this into a conversation for the benefit of those brave enough to join us this afternoon. Do you think, and I'm hearkening back here on Gabe's introduction, do you think your being Israeli born has something to do with this? In other words, is this the sort of theory that only someone who grew up in Israel and was educated in America, and as you said, had that kind of outsider's perspective, could just, waltz into a subject and see, oh, that?
No. No, I don't think so. Maybe I bring a certain sensitivity to the topic, but sometimes being too close to the topic is a hindrance. You are, you feel the shackles of your tradition, of your past, of your upbringing, of the expectation of your ideology. Certainly if you are in Israel, where the Holocaust is very politicized, it's perhaps the place where the Holocaust is most politicized historiography in the world, because the Holocaust and the justification for the Jewish state goes hand in hand. So I'm not so sure. I think the fact that I did my training in America and then lived for a lot of years in America, this helped me actually to get some distance from the subject matter. It's part of me, it's always going to be part of me, but I acquired other ways of looking at it. But I think it comes also from my historical perspective, which is always tries to say that things are always more complex than what they seem, and that oppositional things actually reside together because commingle. Because we as human beings, we have a lot of contradictions. So a lot of things that seemed oppositional to a lot of Holocaust historians, to me seemed actually that they can reside together. Christianity and race. Eliminating the Jews and wanting to tell the stories at the same time.
The Nazis and Freud, if you could say another word about that.
The Nazi and Freud. A book that influenced me a great deal was Freud's Moses and Monotheism. Which of course his thesis is...
which is written, I'm sorry to interrupt, as the Nazis were already in power.
Yeah, in the mid-30s, when Freud was very worried about, so what is he was really asking himself, what are the roots of anti-Semitism? And he goes back to Egypt, and we don't want to go there. However, it influenced me and it linked with my interest in the topic, namely that when we human beings and collectivities give meaning to our life, the relations that we have to look are not causal relations. We as scholars, as historians, when we want to understand people, it's not about causality, it's not about rationality, it's about the fantasies that people tell themselves about who they are. When people tell themselves a true story about themselves, this is really uninteresting. Or maybe it's interesting because it's so rare, if it happens at all. But when people tell themselves fantasies about the world, that there is these people there that is spaceless and timeless, and they're called the Jews, and they want to kill us, and we have to send all of these people, children included, to gas chambers. Now, this is a really interesting fantasy. Where did they come from? That's, I think, what really fascinates me and takes into consideration how precarious we are as human beings and how all of us have all sorts of ideas that future generations or our kids or grandkids will say, how did they think so? Where did they bring it from?
And so I want to conclude my part of the question asking by doing probably the most uncharitable thing one could do to a historian, which is ask you to comment on the present. The resurgence we're seeing now of people like, say, the gunman who shot up the kosher supermarket in Paris, is there anything recognizable in this annihilationist fantasy in the thinking and acting of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas?
I think what we can take from my book about this is the realization that people with these kind of ideologies have to be taken seriously, that they have a body of work, that they are not simply some riffraff or some people who are not educated, and if only I'll sit with them and I'll explain them what is the truth and what is morality, they will say, oh, Alon, absolutely, you convinced me totally. I now became a liberal. No, we have to take these people seriously. We have to look at why they think what they think. They have an ideology, they have a body of work, and they believe in it, and we have to look seriously at their fantasies, not to dismiss it. Just like it would be wrong to dismiss the Nazis. If we want to understand them, we have to think, where did it come from? So I wouldn't say that there is a direct connection, but there is this idea that to take evil seriously, you have to wish to understand its roots and its fantasies.
This is a perfect note.